A partner in the shadows. The courtroom was a place of cold, sterile justice, or so Michael Carter had always believed. A veteran officer with a sterling record, he had dedicated 15 years of his life to the badge, to upholding the ideals of law and order. But today, the same system he had served so loyally had betrayed him. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding crack, cutting through the tense silence. "Guilty," the judge declared, the word ringing in Michael's ears like a death knell. The sound made his heart sink, not for himself, but for his most steadfast partner, Luke, his loyal K-9. Michael's life had unraveled in the span of weeks. A drug bust gone wrong, evidence planted, and all fingers pointed at him. He had seen the pieces fall into place with chilling precision. Yet, no one had listened to his pleas of innocence. The prosecutor's case was airtight, the evidence damning. Michael knew it had been orchestrated, but he couldn't prove it. Now he faced years behind bars, his reputation shredded, his life destroyed. But worse than the sentence was the thought of losing Luke. The German shepherd sat obediently at the back of the courtroom, his keen eyes locked on Michael. Luke had been more than a partner. He was family. The two had braved perilous situations together, from breaking up violent gangs to searching for survivors in disasters. Luke's unwavering loyalty had been a source of strength for Michael, especially during the darkest moments of his career. And now, as the bailiff approached to lead him away, Michael couldn't bear the thought of leaving Luke behind. "Your Honor," Michael called, his voice cracking. He turned to the judge, desperation etched into every line of his face. "Before I'm taken away, I have one last request. Please, let me say goodbye to Luke." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Even the judge hesitated, his expression softening for a moment. Finally, he nodded. 3 minutes, he said, his tone firm but understanding. The bailiff unlatched the gate, and Luke bolted toward Michael. The sound of his claws clicking on the floor echoed through the room. Michael dropped to his knees, pulling the dog into a fierce embrace. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I let you down. I won't be there anymore." Luke whimpered softly, his nose burying into Michael's shoulder. For a brief moment, the rest of the world faded away. Then Luke's posture shifted, his body tensed, and his ears perked up. His nose worked furiously against Michael's jacket, pulling and tugging at the fabric with sharp barks. "Luke, what is it?" Michael asked, startled. The dog's bark grew louder, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. He pawed at Michael's jacket, his movements urgent. A bailiff stepped forward, unsure of what to do, but Luke's determination was unshakable. "Let the dog work," someone murmured from the back of the room. With a final tug, Luke pulled something loose from the jacket's lining. It fell to the floor with a metallic clink, a small black recording device. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as all eyes turned to the object. "What's the dog doing?" the judge demanded, his frown deepening. Michael stared at the device in disbelief. He hadn't placed it there, but Luke's discovery ignited a spark of hope in his chest. Was this the break he had been waiting for? The officer closest to the recorder bent down to pick it up, holding it up for everyone to see. "What's this?" the judge asked sharply. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his face pale. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. It's clearly been planted to derail the proceedings." Silence. The judge barked, slamming his gavel. "Officer, activate the device." The room held its breath as the officer pressed the play button. Static filled the air, followed by muffled voices. Then, clear as day, a gruff voice spoke. "Just plant the evidence. No one's going to question it. Carter's clean record makes him the perfect scapegoat. Get it done." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, whispers, and shouts filled the air. Michael's heart raced. He recognized the voice. It was Captain Ray Harding, his former supervisor and trusted mentor. "This doesn't prove anything," the prosecutor shouted, stepping forward. But the judge cut him off with a sharp glare. "Sit down." The judge turned his attention to Michael. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone grave, "it seems this case is far from over. Bailiff, escort the defendant to holding. Officer, secure that device. This trial is adjourned until further notice." As Michael was led away, he turned back to Luke, who stood alert, his sharp eyes watching every move. Michael felt a surge of gratitude and determination. For the first time in weeks, hope flickered in his chest. Luke had uncovered something no one else could. Now the fight wasn't just for his freedom, it was for the truth. And he wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Shadows of betrayal. Michael sat on the hard bench of the holding cell, his back pressed against the cold, rough concrete wall. His mind raced as he tried to piece together everything that had happened in the courtroom. Luke's discovery of the recording device was a revelation, a glimmer of hope. But it also opened the door to a darker truth he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. The voice on the recording echoed in his mind. "Just plant the evidence. No one's going to question it." It belonged to Captain Ray Harding, a man Michael had respected and trusted for over a decade. The betrayal cut deep, leaving him questioning everything he thought he knew about the department and the people within it. Michael clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. Harding wasn't just his superior. He had been a mentor, a guide through the often turbulent waters of police work. The realization that Harding had framed him was like a punch to the gut. And yet Michael knew that Harding couldn't have acted alone. The corruption had to run deeper, but how deep? How many others were involved? A loud clang jolted Michael from his thoughts. The cell door opened, and an officer stepped in. "Carter, you've got a visitor," the man said, his tone neutral but professional. Michael stood, his heart pounding. As he followed the officer down the dimly lit corridor, he wondered who it could be. His attorney, Sarah Mitchell, his closest friend on the force, or someone else entirely. When he entered the small visitation room, he stopped short. Sitting at the table was Judge Turner, the same judge who had presided over his trial. The older man's expression was unreadable, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Have a seat, Mr. Carter," the judge said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. Michael hesitated but complied. "Your Honor," he began, "I didn't expect to see you here." The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together on the table. "This isn't a formal visit," he said. "I've come because I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Michael frowned. "The recording should speak for itself. Captain Harding framed me." "Yes," the judge said slowly, "but framing a decorated officer like you isn't something one man could pull off alone. That recording raises more questions than it answers. And if Harding's involved, there's a good chance others in the department are too." Michael's stomach churned. "I've suspected for weeks that this goes beyond Harding," he admitted. "But I don't have any proof, except what Luke found." The judge nodded. "That dog of yours might have uncovered the tip of the iceberg. But if we're going to expose the whole operation, we need more than just a recording. We need names, evidence, and someone who knows the system from the inside." Michael met the judge's gaze. "You're asking me to help." The judge's expression hardened. "I'm asking you to fight for the truth. You've been wrongfully convicted, Carter, but you're also one of the few people who can navigate the department's inner workings without raising suspicion. If you're willing, we can build a case strong enough to bring everyone involved to justice." Michael leaned back in his chair, the enormity of the request sinking in. "And if I say no?" The judge's eyes softened. "Then you'll serve your time while those responsible continue to ruin lives. But I don't think you're the kind of man who can walk away from this." Michael looked down at his hands, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. He thought of Luke, of the loyal dog who had risked everything to uncover the recording. He thought of the years he had spent upholding justice, believing in the integrity of the badge. And he thought of the people who had betrayed that trust, who had turned the system into a weapon for their own gain. Finally, he nodded. "I'll do it. The judge's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. We'll start by reviewing everything we have. I've already arranged for Sarah Mitchell to assist with the investigation. She's been combing through old case files, and she's found some discrepancies that might be tied to Harding." Michael's chest tightened at the mention of Sarah. She had been his closest confidant on the force, a voice of reason during the most chaotic times. If anyone could help him unravel this conspiracy, it was her. The judge stood. "You'll be transferred to a secure location tonight. We can't risk leaving you here, not with what you know. Be ready." As Michael was led back to his cell, he felt a spark of determination ignite within him. For weeks, he had been drowning in despair, convinced that his life was over. But now he had a purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting to expose the truth, to bring justice to those who had corrupted the system he had sworn to protect. That night, as he sat in the dimly lit cell, he heard a familiar sound, the soft click of claws on concrete. He looked up to see Luke standing in the doorway, his sharp eyes locked on Michael. The officer accompanying Luke spoke up. "The judge pulled some strings. He figured you'd need your partner for what's coming next." Michael crouched down, pulling Luke into a tight embrace. "I missed you, buddy," he whispered. Luke let out a soft bark, his tail wagging. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a flicker of hope. Together, he and Luke had faced danger before, and together, they would face whatever came next. The fight was just beginning, and Michael was ready to see it through to the end. A trail of lies. The dim light of the secure safe house flickered as Michael and Sarah sat around a cluttered table covered with files, photographs, and hastily scribbled notes. Luke lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, his sharp eyes flicking between his human companions. The air was heavy with tension, but beneath it was a growing sense of purpose. "This is bigger than I thought," Sarah said, breaking the silence. She leaned forward, pushing a grainy photograph toward Michael. It showed Captain Ray Harding shaking hands with a man Michael didn't recognize. "This man," she continued, tapping the photo, "is Jacob Vance. He's a known associate of the cartel crime syndicate. Harding didn't just frame you. He's working with organized crime." Michael's jaw tightened as he studied the photo. Harding was always ambitious, but this is something else. "How long do you think he's been involved?" Sarah shrugged, her expression grim. "Years, maybe. I've been combing through old case files, and I'm finding inconsistencies in reports that go back almost a decade. Missing evidence, altered witness statements, even cases that were quietly dropped without explanation." Michael ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. And no one noticed. No one said anything. "Maybe they did," Sarah said softly, "but Harding has a lot of influence. Anyone who got too close to the truth probably found themselves in a situation like yours, or worse." Michael's thoughts drifted to the anonymous text message he'd received the night before. "You're digging too deep. Stop, or you'll regret it." It was a stark reminder of the danger they were in. Whoever was behind this wouldn't hesitate to silence them if they got too close. "What about the initials?" Michael asked, shifting gears. "In those documents we found. AAR. Any idea who that could be?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. But whoever they are, they're at the top of the chain. Harding might be running the day-to-day operations, but AR is pulling the strings." Michael nodded, his mind racing. They needed more evidence, something that could expose the entire operation and not just Harding. But where to start? That evening, Sarah and Michael decided to follow up on a lead, an old case that had been flagged in their investigation. It was a drug bust from 5 years ago, one that Harding had overseen personally. The case had seemed routine at the time, but the files they'd reviewed suggested otherwise. Witness statements had been redacted, and critical evidence had mysteriously vanished. "This case," Sarah said as they drove through the city in an unmarked car, "is a linchpin. If we can find out what really happened, it might lead us straight to AR." Michael glanced at her, then at Luke, who was seated in the back, his nose pressed to the window. "Let's hope we're not walking into a trap." The location they were headed to was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. According to the records, it had been the site of the drug bust in question. As they pulled up to the dilapidated building, Michael's instincts went on high alert. The place was too quiet, too still. "Stay sharp," he said as they stepped out of the car. Luke trotted beside him, his ears perked and his movements deliberate. The warehouse was a maze of rusted metal and broken glass. Sarah carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. They moved carefully, scanning every corner for signs of danger. Luke led the way, his nose working overtime. "I don't like this," Sarah muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too quiet." Michael nodded. His hand hovered near his sidearm as they entered the main chamber of the warehouse. In the center of the room was a pile of old crates and debris, covered in a thick layer of dust. But something caught Luke's attention. The dog sniffed the ground, then barked sharply, his tail stiff. "What is it, boy?" Michael crouched beside him, following his gaze. There, partially hidden beneath one of the crates, was a folder. Michael reached for it, his fingers brushing against the brittle paper. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Michael froze, his eyes meeting Sarah's. She had already drawn her weapon, her flashlight trained on the far end of the room. "We're not alone," she whispered. Luke growled low, his stance protective. Michael grabbed the folder and stuffed it into his jacket before rising to his feet. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a shadow emerged from the darkness. A tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured. He was unarmed, but his presence was anything but friendly. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his tone cold. "Leave now, and I might forget I saw you." Michael stepped forward, his hand resting on Luke's back. "Who are you? What do you know about Harding?" The man smirked. "Harding's just a pawn. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. Walk away before you get yourself and your friends killed." Sarah took a step closer, her weapon still trained on the man. "We're not walking away. Not until we expose the truth." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a look of disdain. "Suit yourself," he said, "but you've been warned." Before they could react, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows. Michael started to follow, but Luke barked sharply, stopping him in his tracks. "He's gone," Sarah said, lowering her weapon. "And we got what we came for. Let's get out of here." Back at the safe house, Michael and Sarah examined the folder. It contained photographs, handwritten notes, and a map of the city with several locations marked. One name kept appearing in the notes: Arkham Logistics. It was a shell company, likely a front for the Cartelli Syndicate's operations. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice filled with determination. "This ties Harding, and probably AR, to the Cartellis. If we can connect this to the redacted cases, we'll have them." Michael nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead. The man at the warehouse had been a messenger, a warning. They were getting closer to the truth, and the people behind this operation knew it. "We need to move fast," Michael said. "They won't give us another warning." As he spoke, Luke patted over and rested his head on Michael's knee. The gesture was simple, but it gave Michael a sense of grounding. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting to take back the system that had betrayed them. And they wouldn't stop until the whole truth came to light. The ties that bind. The discovery of the folder from the warehouse felt like a turning point. As Michael and Sarah pored over the documents in their safe house, the connections became clearer and more sinister. The marked locations on the map weren't random. They corresponded to key sites tied to unsolved cases, raids, and so-called accidents over the last 5 years. Each one had a direct or indirect link to Captain Harding and the shadowy shell company, Arkham Logistics. Michael tapped his finger on one of the locations, a small warehouse on the city's east side. "This one," he said, his voice steady but intense. "It was the site of an arson 3 years ago. The official story claimed it was gang-related, but no one was ever arrested. The report says all evidence burned in the fire." Sarah leaned over, her brow furrowed. "And yet, that warehouse belonged to Arkham Logistics," she said, pointing to a notation in the folder. "If this company is a front for the cartels, it's likely they were clearing out evidence before anyone could trace it back to them." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "And Harding was in charge of that investigation. Convenient." Luke, lying nearby, suddenly perked up, his ears twitching. He stood and padded to the window, his nose pressed against the glass. Michael's hand instinctively went to his weapon. "What is it, boy?" Sarah joined him at the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. "I don't see anything," she whispered, but her tone was cautious. Michael trusted Luke's instincts. "We need to be careful," he said. "If that guy at the warehouse was willing to show his face, it means they're getting desperate. They know we're closing in." The next day, they decided to act. The map had provided too many leads to ignore, but the East Side warehouse seemed the most pressing. Sarah argued that they should alert the FBI, but Michael was reluctant. "They won't move fast enough," he said. "And if word leaks, whoever's behind this will disappear before we can nail them. We have to do this ourselves." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed, and the two of them, with Luke in tow, set out under the cover of night. The East Side warehouse was in worse shape than the one they had visited before. Its corrugated metal walls were rusted, and the surrounding area was littered with debris. The smell of mildew and stale smoke lingered in the air. It was clear no one had maintained the site since the fire. "This place screams trap," Sarah muttered as they approached. She adjusted her holster and scanned the area, her eyes sharp. Michael held up a hand, signaling for silence. Luke walked beside him, his movements cautious but deliberate. They entered the building through a side door, the hinges creaking loudly in the still night. Inside, the air was damp and cold. The remnants of the fire were evident: charred beams, collapsed sections of the roof, and blackened walls. But despite the devastation, something felt off. Luke's nose worked furiously, sniffing the ground as he led them deeper into the building. They followed him to a section of the warehouse floor that looked relatively untouched by the fire. Luke barked sharply, his tail stiff. "What is it, boy?" Michael knelt beside him and began to examine the area. His fingers brushed against the floor, and he noticed a faint seam in the concrete. Sarah crouched beside him, her flashlight illuminating the spot. "That's a hidden panel," she said, her voice low. "Help me lift it." Together, they pried open the panel, revealing a small compartment beneath the floor. Inside were several boxes, each sealed with tape bearing the logo of Arkham Logistics. Michael's heart pounded as he pulled one of the boxes free and opened it. Inside were folders, flash drives, and photographs. The contents were damning: detailed records of bribes, falsified reports, and payments to officers. But the most shocking discovery was a ledger that listed names, dates, and transactions, all tied to AR. Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. "This is it," she whispered. "This proves everything. Harding, the cartels, Arkham Logistics. It's all connected." Michael's relief was short-lived. A sound echoed through the warehouse, the distinct crunch of boots on gravel. He froze, his hand going to his weapon as Luke let out a low growl. "They're here," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. She quickly stuffed the documents into her bag. "We need to move." But before they could retreat, a voice called out, "Going somewhere." They turned to see a group of armed men blocking the exit. At their center was the man from the previous warehouse encounter, his smirk more sinister now. "I warned you," he said, shaking his head. "You should have listened." Michael stepped in front of Sarah and Luke, his weapon drawn. "You're making a mistake," he said. "We have enough evidence to bring you all down." The man laughed. "Evidence doesn't matter when you're dead." The standoff was tense. Michael could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him, but his focus was sharp. Luke stood beside him, his growl low and threatening. Sarah shifted her stance, her own weapon ready. "If you think we're going down without a fight, you don't know us." The man's smirk faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Kill them," he ordered. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the warehouse as Michael and Sarah fired back, using the debris for cover. Luke darted into action, his powerful form a blur as he charged one of the attackers. The man screamed as Luke's jaws clamped down on his arm, disarming him. Michael's training kicked in, his movements precise as he took down one attacker after another. Sarah was equally formidable, her shots calculated and effective. But the attackers kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. "We can't stay here," Sarah shouted over the gunfire. "We're outnumbered." Michael glanced at the hidden compartment. "We need to secure those documents. If they get destroyed, this was all for nothing." Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "Cover me." As Michael provided cover fire, Sarah retrieved the remaining files and stuffed them into her bag. Luke continued to fight with unrelenting ferocity, his loyalty and courage unmatched. "Got it," Sarah yelled. "Let's move." Michael whistled sharply, calling Luke back to his side. The dog obeyed instantly, his sharp eyes locked on Michael as they retreated toward the side door. They burst out into the night, the cool air hitting their faces as they sprinted toward their car. The attackers didn't give chase immediately, likely regrouping, but Michael knew they wouldn't be far behind. As they sped away, Sarah clutched the bag of evidence tightly. "That was too close," she said, her voice shaking slightly. Michael nodded, his grip on the steering wheel firm. "But we got what we needed. Now we take this to the judge." Luke sat in the back seat, his breathing heavy but steady. Michael reached back to scratch behind his ears. "You did good, buddy," he said softly. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt a sliver of hope. They had uncovered a critical piece of the puzzle, but the fight was far from over. The people behind Arkham Logistics wouldn't stop until they were silenced. But Michael wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The truth was within reach, and he would do whatever it took to expose it. The web unravels. The ride back to the safe house was silent, the air tense with unspoken thoughts. Sarah clutched the bag of evidence as though her life depended on it, and perhaps it did. Michael drove with laser focus, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. Luke sat in the back seat, his body still and alert, as if sensing the danger that loomed just out of sight. "They won't let this go," Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her unease. "We've poked the beast, and now it's awake." Michael nodded, his jaw tight. "Let them come. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make." Sarah wasn't convinced. "We barely made it out of there alive, Michael. This isn't just about exposing Harding or Arkham Logistics anymore. Whoever AR is, they have resources, people willing to kill to protect them. We're not dealing with a few corrupt cops. This is a network." Michael didn't respond immediately. His mind raced, replaying the events at the warehouse. The men who had ambushed them weren't random thugs. They were organized, trained, and equipped. An extension of the corruption they were trying to expose. Luke let out a low whine, breaking Michael's train of thought. He glanced at the dog through the rearview mirror and felt a pang of guilt. Luke had been his partner through thick and thin, and now he was being dragged into something far more dangerous than they'd ever faced before. "We have the evidence," Michael said finally. "We just need to make sure it gets into the right hands." "And who are the right hands?" Sarah shot back. "Harding has allies everywhere, and we don't know how far this thing reaches. For all we know, the FBI could already be compromised." Michael's grip on the steering wheel tightened. She was right, of course. The web of corruption they were up against was vast and insidious, but that didn't mean they could afford to do nothing. "We take it to Judge Turner," he said, He's the only one I trust right now. He's already put his neck on the line by reopening my case. If anyone can push this forward, it's him." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But we need to move fast. The longer we sit on this, the more time they have to come after us." The safe house was quiet when they arrived. The surrounding woods shrouded in darkness. Michael killed the engine and stepped out of the car, his senses on high alert. Luke followed closely, his ears perked and his movements deliberate. Sarah carried the bag of evidence inside, setting it on the table in the center of the room. "We need to go through this, piece by piece," she said. "If there's anything we missed, we can't afford to overlook it now." Michael nodded, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He opened the bag and began sorting through the contents. The ledger was the most damning piece, a detailed record of bribes, falsified reports, and payments funneled through Arkham Logistics. But there was more. Photographs of Harding meeting with known criminals, financial records linking him to the Cartelli syndicate, and emails that hinted at an even larger conspiracy. One email in particular caught Michael's attention. It was from an anonymous account, addressed to Harding. The subject line read, "Operation Vanguard." "What's this?" he muttered, holding up the printout. Sarah leaned over to read it. "Looks like instructions," she said. "It mentions a series of coordinated raids, but the targets don't make sense. They're low priority, small-time operations." Michael frowned. "It's a smoke screen," he said. "They were using those raids to distract from something bigger." Sarah flipped through the ledger, her eyes scanning the entries. "Here," she said, pointing to a line item. "A massive transfer to Arkham Logistics on the same day as those raids. Whatever they were covering up, it was big." Michael leaned back in his chair, the pieces clicking into place. "They're laundering money," he said. "The raids were a cover to move funds through Arkham Logistics without raising suspicion, and Harding was the one making sure no one looked too closely." Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "And if that's true, then AR is the one running the whole operation. They're the key." The next morning, Michael and Sarah arranged a meeting with Judge Turner. The judge had insisted on discretion, choosing an unassuming diner on the outskirts of the city as their rendezvous point. Michael didn't like the idea of meeting in public, but they had little choice. Luke sat alert in the back seat as they pulled into the diner's parking lot. Michael scanned the area, his instincts on high alert. Everything seemed normal, but that only made him more uneasy. Inside, Judge Turner was already seated at a corner booth, a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as they approached, his expression serious. "Did you bring it?" he asked, his voice low. Michael placed the bag of evidence on the table. "It's all here," he said. "This proves Harding's involvement, and it points to someone higher up, someone using the initials AR." The judge's eyes narrowed as he opened the bag and began sifting through the contents. His expression grew darker with each piece of evidence he reviewed. "This is explosive," he said finally. "If we can tie this to AR, it could bring down the entire network." Michael leaned forward. "The problem is, we don't know who AR is. They've stayed in the shadows, pulling the strings while Harding and others do their dirty work." The judge nodded. "We'll need to approach this carefully. If we move too soon, we risk tipping them off. But if we wait too long..." Before he could finish, the sound of shattering glass cut through the diner. Everyone froze as a masked man burst through the door, a gun drawn. "Get down," the man shouted, his weapon trained on the judge. Michael reacted instantly, pulling Sarah and Luke behind the booth for cover. He drew his own weapon, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through him. The man fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "You don't know who you're messing with," he snarled. "Walk away, and you might live." Michael's mind raced. This wasn't a random attack. It was a message, a desperate attempt to stop them from moving forward. But it only solidified his resolve. "I don't think so," Michael said, stepping out from behind the booth, his weapon trained on the man. "You're the one who should walk away." The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward the bag of evidence. Michael didn't give him the chance to act. With a single precise shot, he disarmed the attacker, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Luke lunged forward, pinning the man to the ground as Michael and Sarah moved to secure him. The diner erupted into chaos as patrons scrambled for the exits. Judge Turner stood, his face pale but determined. "This proves we're on the right track," he said, his voice steady. "But it also means we're running out of time." Michael nodded, his eyes hard. "Then we'd better make our next move count." As Luke growled low, holding the would-be assailant in place, Michael knew the fight was far from over. They had the evidence, but exposing the truth would take everything they had, and then some. Michael knelt down beside the attacker, his gun still trained on him. Luke stood firm, his sharp teeth bared as a warning. The man beneath him struggled but quickly froze when Michael pressed the barrel of his weapon against his shoulder. "Who sent you?" Michael demanded, his voice cold and steady. The man didn't answer, his eyes darting nervously toward the bag on the table. Sarah stepped forward, crouching to meet the man's gaze. "You don't strike me as the type who'd die for someone else's cause," she said, her tone sharp. "Tell us who sent you, and maybe we can work something out." The man remained silent, but the flicker of fear in his eyes betrayed him. Michael exchanged a glance with Sarah. They didn't have time for games. Michael leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "You've already lost. You think we're the ones in trouble. Look around. You're alone, unarmed, and pinned by a dog who could end this conversation right now. Talk." The man swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his brow. Finally, he muttered, "They'll kill me." "Who will?" Sarah pressed. "Harding. Or is it AR?" At the mention of AR, the man's eyes widened slightly. Michael caught the reaction immediately. "It's them, isn't it? AR. That's who you're afraid of." The man's jaw clenched, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he whispered, "You don't understand. You can't stop them." Michael's patience wore thin. "We'll see about that. But first, you're going to tell us everything you know." The man hesitated, his gaze shifting to Judge Turner, who stood nearby, watching intently. The judge stepped forward, his authoritative presence filling the room. "You're in a precarious position," the judge said calmly. "If you cooperate, I can ensure leniency. If not, you'll face the full weight of the law. And trust me, we'll make sure the evidence against you is airtight." The man's resolve cracked. He sighed heavily, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his predicament. "All I know is that AR runs everything. The deals, the money, the hits. They've got people everywhere. Cops, lawyers, politicians. You'll never find them." Michael's jaw tightened. He pressed further. "Where's Harding? Is he working with AR directly, or is he just another pawn?" The man shook his head. "Harding's high up, but even he takes orders. AR gives the commands. Harding just makes sure the pieces fall into place." Michael stood, frustration boiling under his skin. They were getting closer, but it wasn't enough. The man was a small cog in a massive machine, and taking him down wouldn't stop the rest of it from grinding forward. After the authorities arrived to take the attacker into custody, Michael, Sarah, and Judge Turner regrouped at the safe house. The attack had made one thing clear: they were running out of time. The longer they waited, the more dangerous the situation became. Sarah paced the room, her frustration evident. "We're so close, but it feels like every step forward just raises more questions." Michael sat at the table, his hand resting on Luke's head. The dog had been restless since the diner, his instincts sharp and his gaze always alert. "We need to flush AR out," Michael said finally. "If they're pulling the strings, they're the one we have to take down." Judge Turner leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "We may not know who AR is, but we have something they don't. A way to expose them. The ledger, the photos, the emails, it's all damning evidence. If we go public, we can force their hand." Sarah hesitated. Going public is risky. If we're not careful, they could bury this before it even reaches the surface. We need a plan. Michael nodded. We need to control the narrative. We leak just enough to draw them out but keep the most damning evidence under wraps until we have a clear shot. The judge tapped his fingers against the table. I have contacts in the media, trusted reporters who won't back down under pressure. If we provide them with the initial evidence, they can start the story. But we'll need to move fast. Once the story breaks, AR will know we're coming for them. Michael's mind raced. It was a bold move, but it was their best shot. Let's do it, he said, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next. That night, Michael and Sarah worked tirelessly to compile the evidence. They chose the most incriminating pieces, the ledger entries, the photos of Harding, and the financial records, and encrypted them for secure transmission to the reporters Judge Turner trusted. By dawn, the first whispers of the story had begun to spread. The headline was simple but powerful. Corruption exposed. Evidence links police captain to organized crime. As Michael watched the news coverage from the safe house, he felt a surge of determination. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back now. Luke sat beside him, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Michael reached down to scratch behind his ears. It's just us against the world, buddy, he said softly. But we've been here before. We'll get through this. Sarah entered the room, her phone in hand. We've got a problem, she said, her tone urgent. Michael looked up, his pulse quickening. What is it? She handed him the phone. On the screen was a message from an unknown number. You made a mistake. Now, everyone pays. Michael's heart sank as the implications hit him. They had drawn AR out, but the cost might be more than they were prepared to pay. The fight was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised. The final stand. The air in the safe house felt heavy, oppressive, as Michael read the cryptic message again. You made a mistake. Now, everyone pays. It was a threat, plain and simple, and it carried the weight of a promise. His grip on the phone tightened, and he glanced at Sarah, who was pacing with nervous energy. They know we're close, Sarah said, her voice strained. This isn't just a scare tactic. They're coming for us. Michael nodded, his mind racing. The safe house, though secluded, was no longer safe. If AR wanted to silence them, they wouldn't stop until the job was done. He looked at Luke, who sat alert and ready, as if sensing the storm that was about to break. We need to move, Michael said firmly. If they find us here, we're sitting ducks. We take the fight to them. Sarah stopped pacing, her brow furrowing. And where exactly do we take it? AR is still a ghost. All we have are breadcrumbs. Michael shook his head. Not anymore. We know they're tied to Arkham Logistics, and that message. It's their mistake. They're trying to intimidate us, but it means they're watching. They'll come to us if we set the right trap. Sarah crossed her arms, her skepticism evident. And how do you plan to pull that off? Invite them to a meet and greet. Michael gave a grim smile. Something like that. The plan was risky, bordering on reckless, but it was their only option. Michael and Sarah would stage a public drop of the remaining evidence, baiting AR into making a move. With Judge Turner's help, they secured a meeting at an abandoned industrial site, one that had once been a shipping hub for Arkham Logistics. Michael called the reporters who had broken the initial story, giving them just enough information to guarantee coverage, but not enough to endanger the operation. The reporters agreed to remain nearby, ready to capture anything that unfolded. The trap was set. The industrial site was a sprawling complex of crumbling buildings and rusted machinery. Shadows stretched long in the fading evening light as Michael, Sarah, and Luke arrived. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Sarah set up a laptop on an old workbench, uploading files to a secure server while Michael scouted the area. Luke stayed close, his movements precise and deliberate. Every creak of metal, Every gust of wind felt like a prelude to the inevitable confrontation. "They'll come," Michael said, his voice low but resolute. "They have to. If we release everything, their whole operation crumbles." Sarah glanced at him, her expression serious. "And if they don't?" Michael's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they have no place to hide." An hour passed before they heard the first sign of movement, a faint rumble, the sound of vehicles approaching. Michael signaled Sarah to stay behind cover while he positioned himself near the entrance. Luke crouched low beside him, his sharp eyes locked on the approaching headlights. 3 black SUVs rolled into the site, their engines cutting off in unison. Doors opened, and men stepped out, heavily armed and dressed in tactical gear. At their center was Captain Harding, his expression a mix of fury and desperation. Michael stepped into the open, his weapon at the ready. "Harding," he called out, his voice echoing across the empty complex. "Finally decided to show your face." Harding's smirk was humorless. "You should have stayed in prison, Carter. You were a good cop. Too bad you didn't know when to quit." Michael felt his blood boil, but he kept his voice steady. "You betrayed the badge, Harding. You sold out everything we stood for. But it ends tonight." Harding laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "You think you've won. You're a pawn in a game you don't even understand. And now, you're out of moves." Behind Harding, another figure emerged from one of the SUVs, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit. His presence exuded authority and menace, and Michael knew instantly who he was. "AR, I presume," Michael said, his tone sharp. The man smiled, a predator's smile. "You've been causing quite the mess, Mr. Carter. I admire your persistence, but you've overstayed your welcome." Michael's grip on his weapon tightened. "The evidence is out there. Your network's collapsing. It's over." AR tilted his head, his expression calm and calculating. "You think a few files will stop us? Systems like ours don't die, Mr. Carter. They adapt. You, however, won't live to see that." With a subtle nod from AR, Harding, and the armed men raised their weapons. But before they could fire, Luke lunged from the shadows, his powerful form barreling into one of the gunmen. The chaos erupted like a thunderclap. The firefight was intense, the air filled with the deafening crack of gunfire and the shouts of men. Michael moved with precision, taking cover behind rusted machinery and returning fire with deadly accuracy. Sarah joined the fray, her shots calculated and relentless. Luke was a force of nature, his instincts razor-sharp as he took down attackers with unrelenting ferocity. He moved like a shadow, a blur of motion that left their enemies scrambling. Harding, realizing the tide was turning, began to retreat toward one of the SUVs. Michael saw him and gave chase, his anger propelling him forward. "You're not getting away, Harding," Michael shouted. The two clashed near the vehicle, exchanging blows in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. Harding was strong, but Michael's resolve was stronger. With a final, devastating punch, Harding collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Meanwhile, Sarah and Luke had cornered AR, who stood unarmed but unshaken. "This won't stop anything," he said calmly. "Take me in, kill me. It won't matter. The network will continue." Michael approached, his weapon trained on AR. "Not if we burn it to the ground." By the time the authorities arrived, the battle was over. Harding and AR were taken into custody, along with the remaining gunmen. The reporters who had been waiting in the wings captured everything, ensuring the story would spread far and wide. As Michael stood amid the aftermath, Luke by his side, he felt a profound sense of relief. The fight had been grueling, but they had won. Justice had prevailed, and the web of corruption that had nearly destroyed him was unraveling. Sarah approached, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "We did it," she said softly. Michael nodded, his hand resting on Luke's head. "We did." For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The fight was over, but the lessons would stay with him forever. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost. the dawn of justice. As the flashing lights of police cars and news vans lit up the industrial site, Michael stood amidst the chaos, his thoughts racing. The arrests of Captain Harding and AR were only the beginning. The evidence they had gathered would take down more than just these two. It would expose an entire network of corruption, greed, and betrayal. But for now, the fight was over. Luke sat beside him, his head held high, his coat streaked with dust and dirt from the fight. Michael crouched beside his loyal partner, scratching behind his ears. "We did it, boy," he said softly. "You did it." Luke let out a soft bark, his tail wagging slightly, as if to say, "We did it together." Sarah approached, a tired but triumphant smile on her face. Her arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage, an injury from the firefight. But she waved off Michael's concerned look. "It's just a graze," she said. "Nothing compared to what we just accomplished." Michael gave her a nod of respect. "You were incredible out there. I couldn't have done this without you." She smirked. "You're right. You couldn't have." Her smile softened. "But seriously, Michael, this is a win. For both of us. For everyone who's been silenced by people like Harding and AR. Judge Turner arrived, escorted by 2 officers, his face etched with both exhaustion and relief. "You've made history tonight," he said, addressing both Michael and Sarah. "The evidence you provided is irrefutable. Harding and AR will face the full weight of the law, and their associates won't be far behind." Michael straightened, his resolve firm. "It's not just about them, Judge. This is about restoring faith in the system. The people who trusted us to protect and serve deserve better." Turner nodded. "And they'll get it. Your fight has shaken the very foundation of this corruption. It won't be easy, but it's a start." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the arrests was seismic. News outlets ran continuous coverage of the scandal, detailing the intricate web of corruption that had infiltrated law enforcement, local government, and organized crime. The evidence Michael and Sarah had uncovered not only led to Harding's conviction, but also implicated dozens of others who had operated in the shadows. Arkham Logistics was dismantled, and its assets were seized. The Cartelli syndicate, crippled by the exposure, found itself under relentless federal scrutiny. Even the name AR, once a specter in the background, became a symbol of the fight against corruption. Michael's name was officially cleared. The charges against him were dismissed, and he was reinstated with full honors. But he knew he couldn't go back to his old life. The betrayal he had experienced had left a permanent mark, and he felt a deeper calling now, to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had. Epilogue. Months later, Michael stood at a podium in front of a packed auditorium. The event was a dedication ceremony for a new initiative aimed at rooting out corruption in law enforcement. Behind him, a large banner read, "Integrity Restored, the Carter Initiative." He adjusted the microphone, taking a moment to steady himself. Luke sat at his side, wearing a polished K9 badge on his collar. The sight of his loyal partner gave Michael the strength to begin. "6 months ago, my life was turned upside down," he started, his voice carrying through the room. "I was framed for crimes I didn't commit by people I trusted, people who wore the same badge I did. I thought my career, my freedom, and my reputation were over. But through it all, I had one constant, my partner, Luke." The audience broke into applause, many smiling at the German shepherd sitting attentively at Michael's side. "Luke reminded me what loyalty and integrity truly mean," Michael continued. "He uncovered the truth when no one else could. And together, we exposed a system that had been rotting from within. Tonight, as we launch this initiative, I want to remind everyone that justice is not just a word. It's a commitment, a responsibility. And it's something worth fighting for." The applause swelled as Michael stepped back from the podium. Sarah joined him, her arm now fully healed, and they shared a smile. Luke barked softly, his tail wagging as if sensing the importance of the moment. As the ceremony concluded, Michael knelt beside Luke, scratching behind his ears. "We did it, boy," he whispered. "And we'll keep doing it." Luke nuzzled against him, his loyalty unwavering. Michael stood, looking out at the crowd, at the reporters, at the officers who had come to support the initiative. He felt a sense of peace and purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. The fight for justice was never ending. But for the first time, Michael felt ready to face whatever came next. And with Luke by his side, he knew he wouldn't face it alone.